My name is Dennis Ojima. I'm here with the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory, the Ecosystem Science and Sustainability Department, and also the University Director for the North Central Climate Science Center. And these institutions are co-sponsoring Managed for Climate Change, the seminar series for the fall. We have some visitors actually from the Climate Science Center, some of our PIs. We're having a sort of a 5-year update. So we have university, USGS, partners, and in fact, Gregor, our speaker today, is part of that research team in working with Amy Simstad of Wind Cave and Badlands National Park. So we're really happy to invite them all here because this is sort of part of the research efforts in sort of looking at how we manage and look at adaptation in various parks. So it's really a pleasure to have Gregor here as our speaker today. He's with the U.S. National Park Service, arriving here about 3 years ago. He's worked with the Wisconsin Natural Resources, looking at adaptation efforts and managing natural resources in those areas. He's been, part of his job is really working with stakeholders and managers, and that's something that we've been struggling with and trying to find mechanisms to enhance our ability to do that. So today he'll be talking about stewarding our national parks, and this is sort of apropos given that this is our centennial of national parks as well. And so it's with great pleasure I'll turn the podium over to Gregor and have us go through his presentation.
Thanks, Dennis. Well, thank you all. The title of my talk is Stewarding National Park Resources in an Era of Continuous Change. I think it fits really well with the theme for the seminar, and this is sort of a big theme in the work we do in the National Park Service, which is to accept the idea of change, embrace that, and work with it, including the associated uncertainties. My biography, very briefly, I'm a terrestrial ecologist who focused on communities and ecosystems in the 90s when I was in grad school. And then slowly, over time, climate change sort of came and found me and the work I was doing and asserted itself and pulled me in. Having said that, I took my first undergrad seminar on global change in the spring of 1990. And so those of us who have been involved in basic science for a while always sort of had an awareness that this issue was looming, and it's obviously just become more and more relevant and pervasive. I notice there's a lot of grad students and maybe postdocs and undergrads in the room, and one thing I'll just say quickly is you're lucky to be in this moment where we're talking so forthrightly about embracing change and about applying our research to important and pressing management questions. When I was in grad school and you said you wanted to do applied work, that was sort of a dangerous thing to say, and it's nice to be so far beyond that and have people so engaged in these pressing problems because we need you and there's space for you. So as Dennis said, my job broadly as an ecologist working in adaptation is to help parks and partners understand and respond to climate change impacts. And before I get too into the details, I just want to describe our program a little bit with a map. There are about 12.5 of us in the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. We're a Washington office, but we are based in Fort Collins, which is a nice combo, and you can see the large green bubble. That's most of us, but we also have members on the East Coast, up in Montana, Denver, Hawaii, on the West Coast, and one of our newest members is Amber Childress, who's in the room here, obviously also a CSU person, but we're happy to claim her as well as a geoscientist and parks intern for the next year. This is just a screen grab of our website, and I grabbed it mostly just to show the banner at the top. As Dennis suggested, this is our centennial. The Park Service is 100 years old, and this has been an occasion to be fairly deliberate about reflecting on a century of success and lessons learned and evolving thinking, and also to look forward and think about emerging threats and challenges that we face. And this has been not only an internal process, but also there's been a lot of media interest in our centennial. And the logical question that comes up is, okay, what about climate change? You're a preservation-oriented agency, and here comes some real threats to that paradigm. And so we've seen articles, for instance, over the last summer. Here's one by Oliver Millman of The Guardian, declaring that climate change will mean the end of national parks as we know them, which sounds rather extreme and hyperbolic, but also if you read it technically, there's an as we know them. It's not the end of parks, but they are going to change. And he references a couple of aspects, changing sea ice, melting glaciers, and so on. So that's undoubtedly true. Specifically, technically, as we know them, they're undergoing change. One might argue they always have, taking a long-term ecological view. Climate Central did a story in May where they sort of just pushed that thing a bit further and said, well, this must be the Parks Service's greatest challenge. And they referenced this Teddy Roosevelt quote to sort of counterpose very preservationist-oriented thinking with the reality of ongoing climate change. A couple more articles started looking at, well, so what do you do about that? Here's one by Greg Brining in Enzia magazine. And in the text under the title, he sort of describes some of the impacts, battered by heat, drought, and flood, and then starts to allude to a spectrum of potential responses, from stubborn resistance to working with and accepting and perhaps trying to direct change. And then another article alluding to another important tool in our toolbox, referring to scenario planning. So the national parks are playing the game of what if to prepare for climate change, and a suggestion that we're using a tool that people have also used to contemplate thermonuclear war. These guys know how to write good hooks. Internally, we've been doing the same thinking, and not just in the centennial year. The Park Service goals and objectives have evolved over time. This isn't the first moment for us to reconsider them, but it's an important one. And a number of years ago, we commissioned a report from our advisory board science committee to sort of help us answer that question. How should we be seeking to steward resources in this era of pervasive accelerating global change? One of the recommendations was essentially, well, you should. That's what you should be doing. So yes, is the answer. The overarching goal should be to steward our resources for continuous change. Well, great. So what does that mean practically to a manager on the ground? That's the work that a program like ours does, is making a high-level suggestion like that into a reality that makes sense on the ground. So my presentation here is in three components. I'll just briefly review some impacts just to provide a little bit of color to what we're talking about. Then I'll detail our response a bit more, and then I'm really going to delve into the tools and the partnerships that we draw on in our work. Let's talk about impacts. This is a map I think many of you may be familiar with. My supervisor and the head of our program, Kat Hawkins-Hoffman, calls it the measles map. And as the text above the map indicates, this is a map showing those 4 out of 5 of our parks that are already extreme warm by at least one measure of temperature when comparing recent climate against the full historical range of variability going back to 1901. And we use an image like this just to communicate with managers and partners and push the understanding that climate change isn't something coming around the bend that we're trying to anticipate. It's an ongoing phenomenon that has already arrived. And a point we make is if you're a manager who hasn't been in your unit very long, chances are you're managing those resources in that unit in conditions that if that park could speak, it would tell you that you're in anomalous conditions already. And of course, these changes are generating impacts. So here's just a sort of a clockwise review of some of these prominent impacts we're seeing. Big droughts in the Southwest, enhanced 15 to 20% by climate change, causing these kinds of declines in our water supplies. We're seeing unprecedentedly severe wildfires. Here's one in 2003 that burned up a significant chunk of Glacier National Park. We're seeing melting permafrost literally destabilizing structures. We're seeing the climate spaces for sensitive species either shifting or being projected to shift, and beginning to see declines in some of our populations. We're seeing changing hydrology, flooding with impacts to cultural and historic resources, which are an important part of the NPS resource management focus. Widespread coral bleaching, of course, and another cultural impact. I just think this sort of illustrates some of the challenges we face. This is Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas off the tip of Florida. It is the largest masonry structure in the New World. It has 16 million bricks, and it is severely challenged by storm surge and sea level rise. So these are some of the challenges we face, and that force us to confront real change rather than pretending it's not going on. Here's a brand new one this month that I thought would be fun to highlight, a paper by Bill Monahan and colleagues that came out a week or two ago. that looked at the evidence and makes the case that climate change is causing an earlier spring onset across our national parks. Secretary Sally Jewell picked this one up, and in her release points out that the statistic is really 3/4 of parks are already seeing a shift in the onset of spring. Often that's accompanied by overall a longer growing season. And in fact, over half of parks have already seen an extreme shift, meaning the onset of spring is at that 5% end of the historical range of variability. Visitation is increasing. So here's a headline from a Montana newspaper, local newspaper, just observing Yellowstone had the busiest month ever. Here's an article a couple of weeks later from National Parks Traveler pointing out the same thing, providing a bit of quantitative information and asking, is this a good thing? And so it presents both a challenge and an opportunity to have more visitors, and certainly we want to harness the opportunities there, but it requires understanding what's going on and planning for it. Work that we did, led by my colleague Nick Fisichella, came out last year looking at visitation data and climate data, found a fairly strong relationship between mean monthly temperature and visitation. I'm not going to delve into the details except to say this is consistent with other work, and it suggests as strongly that the change in visitation that we're seeing across our parks has a temperature signal driving it, found within it. Okay, briefly talking about our agency response to climate change. It's based on leadership, strategy, and then ultimately pushing a paradigm shift or maybe an expansion. And so talking about leadership, this isn't just leadership from the top, but I'll get there, but it's also leadership from the middle in a sense. Superintendents and resource managers in parks who recognize their own individual responsibility, understand the vulnerabilities, and decide individually to focus on climate change and its impacts. People like Bob Krummenacher on the shores of Lake Superior, thinking carefully about lake level projections when he makes $500,000 investments in docks that are supposed to last 30 years. Jeff Mao in Glacier National Park, formerly in Kenai Fjords, watching glaciers melt, causing flooding impacts that affect facilities, infrastructure, and the visitor experience, and wondering what to do about that. Marie Sutter and David Bustos down in White Sands National Monument, who call those gypsum dunes the glaciers of the South because they're so incredibly sensitive to desiccation. And just one more example, Sierra McDaniel in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, working with colleagues to ensure the persistence of very, very rare plant species that have been made rare by previous human impacts and now face unprecedented climate change enhanced drought at high elevation. Also from the very top, often our leaders at the top giving us clear signals to adapt and to jump into this game, come out of that early adopter pool. And this includes our director, John Jarvis, who has a number of quotes like this that really open the door for the rest of us to embrace and work with change. Strategy. Not going to delve far into this. We've had an agency level climate change response strategy since 2010. It has 4 pillars: science, adaptation, mitigation, and communication. And I'll just briefly say, for us, communication is a broad and important field. It's not only communicating with our widely distributed management staff, but it's also with over 300 million visitors who come through parks every year. So this is an important platform to talk about climate change, and it's our research the partners of us have done suggests people really want to hear about it. So this is an important focus of what we do. Focusing on the adaptation and managing for change, which is the subject today, this is really about paradigm shift, as I said. And our message to managers when we introduce the topic of adaptation is that the specific tools and tactics that you will use in adaptation, for the most part, are the same things you use today. And so we will, for instance, continue to raise rare plants and outplant them to stabilize or enhance populations that need that kind of help. We will maintain and repair cultural resources. We will do the same for our infrastructure, and we will manage visitation to enhance and preserve the visitor experience. But the ways we apply those tactics, the sequence, and where we apply them and where we decide not to may change. And that kind of thinking will be guided by new frameworks and structures for doing so. And one of them is climate smart conservation, which I'll delve into in a minute in greater detail, but it's a really great guide for, as it says, putting adaptation principles into practice and closing that gap between high-level guidance and what a manager is trying to do on the ground. The other important tool I'll talk about is using scenarios to explore climate change. So accepting the fact that climate, it could plausibly play out in more than one way and working with that uncertainty. Okay, so let's delve into those tools and those partnerships that we draw on. So my focus here will be on climate smart conservation, scenario planning, and then I'm going to wrap up with a little bit of discussion about legal and policy analysis. So climate smart conservation, before I jump into it, and I know some of you have, so who here has experience with the climate smart guide or has taken or been involved in climate smart training? Okay, so 5 or 6 hands, kind of the folks I thought would put their hands up. This is a great guide. It's dozens and dozens, I don't know, 200 pages long, but don't be daunted by that. It's down-to-earth writing, and it just fills in all the gaps with a lot of great information. It was led by the National Wildlife Federation and then joined by us and a whole host of federal agencies. And the National Wildlife Federation won an award, the National Climate Adaptation Leadership Award, this past June for their leadership in producing this kind of important guidance. This course is taught by the National Conservation Training Center frequently, and I and some others in the room are instructors for that. Highly recommend the course. There is in climate smart conservation, the heart of it is a planning cycle, and it's an elaboration of many standard planning cycles, adaptive management, etc., in that one begins by defining the plan and purpose. What's different here are some climate components that are built in. So step 2, once you've sort of grounded yourself in why you're doing this, is a review of climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And based on that review, a possible review and reconsideration of your goals in the first place. Having stabilized that, you move into identifying possible management options, making a choice, implementing, and most importantly, monitoring the outcome of your action. And this is more important than even historically, because the conditions in which we're managing are departing historical ranges of variability. So we know we have less confidence than we would in the past to understand how our actions are going to play out. Okay, so there's a lot of key concepts and important themes in climate smart adaptation, but these are 4 that I think are some of the biggest, broadest, most important ones. So the first one, act with intentionality, is about basically being able to show your work and show logically how the management actions you're taking connect all the way back to the climate impact to the resource you're seeking to manage. And because the tactics may be common between traditional management approaches and ones that are climate informed, there's a danger of just relabeling what you're doing as adaptation. Yeah, we're controlling invasive species, we're trying to enhance connectivity, and therefore we're doing adaptation. Not good enough. You have to be able to show that the actions you're taking connect all the way back to that impact in a way that's likely to be effective. Concept 2 is integrating adaptation into existing work rather than having standalone adaptation plans. And this is important because of the pervasiveness of climate change. It affects everything. And so if we're going to adapt successfully, we just need to bring that understanding into our existing planning efforts. The last 2 are sort of the biggies in thinking about and getting closer to on-the-ground management. So reconsidering goals and not just strategies. We saw that in our cycle here in step 3. And when you do this reconsideration of goals and you come up with perhaps new ones, you of course need to just take a step back and make sure that you're solid, that those new goals don't have any vulnerabilities that are relevant or new ones. And then in reconsidering those goals, step 4 kind of gives you a nudge for what you ought to be thinking about. And this gets back to that paradigm expansion that we're managing. When we reconsider those goals, we should make sure that we're considering managing for change and not just finding different ways of managing for persistence that may not be tenable. So I'm going to sort of provide some illustration of what this means with a bit more detail. So this is an effort where we actually brought these tools into work we were doing with parks in a CSC-funded project. I'll describe in more detail in a minute. But when you take your goals and your actions and you think about climate projections and you're assessing vulnerabilities or impacts, what you're asking in a sense is, are my current goals and actions tenable? Do they still make sense for the resource I'm thinking about, the locality, and the time horizon? If so, great. You can proceed with your business as usual approach with a solid defense that you've got your intentionality, you've done your thinking, and you're fine. Now, it may be that you want to think about a longer time horizon. Maybe you're in a different locality or a different resource, and you determine that the goal is still tenable, but the means by which you get there may change. We call that a climate retrofit. That's not supposed to be a disparaging term. It's just sort of to describe what that is. You're keeping that original goal, but you're changing your approach. Fine. And then the third option is when you're in a circumstance where you recognize that original goal is not tenable, and you might have to revise both the goal and therefore the actions, and we call that a rebuild. So I'm just going to illustrate this quickly with a fisheries management example. You may be seeking in your original goal to maintain a cold water fish that's historically occurred in a locality. There may have been some impacts in the past that require some annual stocking to maintain that population, and that may be consistent with your context and your goals. And that may be tenable, as I said. Fine, business as usual, proceed. Alternatively, you may find that because of where you are or the time horizon you're thinking about, that you might have to change your approaches a little more stocking, maybe think about restoring riparian vegetation to shade streams. So there's our retrofit. And then ultimately, a longer time horizon, warmer location, you may cut bait on the notion of keeping your cold water fish and embrace a warm water fishery, which at a minimum, you might cease to stock that original species, but you may go further, perhaps wander into a controversial realm and start thinking about managed relocation. When we thought in the Park Service about this, manage for change and not just for persistence, we felt like this is such an important point for us that we needed more text, more definition, more clarity about what that means. And so in a paper that came out at the beginning of this year that was really mostly oriented around the term resilience, which I'm not going to get into, but which we find challenging in adaptation, we kind of laid out this spectrum. So not just change and persistence, but resist change, direct change. What is management doing? Or the middle one, accommodate change. And resist change is basically traditional conservation. And the definition is there to restore or maintain past conditions. That other end of the spectrum, the directing change, we thought about this definition for a long time, and the key is that we're talking about directing the change toward a specific desired new condition. So we really wanted to be clear on what that end of the spectrum was, and that's, of course, where we do our pushing. The middle term is really important for us in the Park Service just because we're generally not a heavy-handed management agency, and we're oriented largely toward trying to allow quote-unquote natural processes to play out. And so there may be a case in which we don't want to steer aggressively backwards or forwards, but we do want to support systems autonomy in responding to change. And an example of this might be we might control invasive species while allowing native plant species in a region to resort under changing climate conditions and form new natural communities. The key in all of this is that options will vary over time across space, and among targets, there's no one right way to do adaptation. And in fact, these different options can often be used very complementarily, either sequentially or simultaneously. And again, in warning people against cleaving simply to resistance, we point out that already both ends of the spectrum are being applied. And so in this example on the left, firefighter Luis Magana is guarding the General Grant tree, a giant sequoia tree in Kings Canyon National Park. This is, as a bit of trivia, the only living national shrine that we own. And I'm not really sure what that means, but it's unique. And so there's aggressive resistance that probably can't be scaled up very far, but we're devoted to that one organism, and we will prevent it from burning down. At the other end, young biologist John McCubbins is releasing the native bull trout above a waterfall in Logging Creek in Glacier National Park. It has never existed above this waterfall before. So this is the most incremental expansion in a native species distribution one could carry out. It's being done here to help this species get away from not only warming temperatures lower down, but also non-native species that compete with it. And so there's an example of a very small but clear directed change happening. In thinking about that spectrum, we like to show this quote by Connie Millar et al. written almost a decade ago, warning against the dangers of overinvesting in resistance and encouraging people again to think beyond just resisting change, talking about the prospect of ultimate failure and increasing a commitment to increasing investment over time. We also point out that because we, in this case, are trying to maintain or restore historical conditions in an ahistorical context, the kind of means we might go about to do so could get fairly ahistorical, unnatural, artificial, and should be thought about fairly carefully. And just sort of as a trivial example, blankets on glaciers, like is done in Europe, might be fine for certain contexts, but I don't think that's going to work in Glacier National Park, for instance, in terms of the artificiality. That's the kind of tensions we're thinking about. So jumping into scenario planning, I'm going to ask the question again here. Who here has experience using scenarios? Okay, some of the usual suspects with their hands up, a couple extra. I would submit to all of you that you have experience using scenarios, at least intuitively. When we make big consequential decisions, the biggies, we generally, unless we're being foolish, we recognize the consequential uncertainties associated. If you're making decisions about investing money, when to retire, how long to work, when to buy a house, when to sell, you're generally thinking about if the economy turns south, how will you fare? If the economy does well, how will you fare? So at least a range of possibilities. And even on shorter term decisions about travel or how to dress or whether to bring an umbrella out, you think about more than one possibility, and then you make a decision based on your own risk tolerance, etc. We think scenarios are really good tools for addressing uncertainty, and we're not alone in this. This is a graphic from our private sector partners who got us started in scenario planning, sort of illustrating the assumption behind a traditional forecast then act approach, which assumes that what you know today is sufficient to predict the conditions in which you will be operating in the future with fairly high precision. There's an acknowledgement of something of an error bar, a 10% error bar around your prediction, but in this illustration, you know it's going to be cloudy, you can plan for that. Scenario planning is really built for this circumstance where getting from what we know today to what's likely to be the conditions we're operating in the future, you go through a lens of uncertainty that could produce fairly divergent scenarios that really don't lend themselves to a single approach in many cases. And so by formally acknowledging that and working with systems that structure these plausible future conditions, we can basically provide a framework by which people can comfortably grapple with uncertainty or with a range of possible future conditions. And ultimately, this is all based on a sort of a call for humility and against hubris. And there's a couple of illustrations here that point out that even in some important consequential past contexts, we've been quite bad at predicting the future with important consequences. And you could all do your own Googling and come up with great examples of this. But here's one from the Vice President of the White Star Line. That boat won't sink. If you close off your mind to that possibility, you probably don't go very far down the path of how many lifeboats does this boat need. And a more recent example, Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, writing off the iPhone as something that would have any appeal less than a decade ago, and he was an expert, of course. And just to provide a bit more background, where have scenarios been used the longest? Where's their deeper history? Anybody?
Defense.
Defense, yep. And the other one is business, as I'll illustrate. So the military has been playing war games and using scenarios for a long, long time. Here's just an image I pulled off the web, 7 deadly scenarios for the 21st century with a special focus on Afghanistan. Here's another thing just pulled off the web, a scenario for how Russian and separatist forces might expand their nibbling away at the southeast corner of the Ukraine. In terms of business, ironically, the oil business has been really good at developing scenarios, Royal Dutch Shell in particular. And so here we are using a tool they created to survive the oil shocks of the 20th century to now help cope with the consequences of all the fossil fuel combustion. So we began using scenarios in 2007, which is several years before we were actually a program. Our leaders sort of began pulling this tool in. We went to the private sector, as I said. We went to a group called the Global Business Network, a very corporate sounding entity, who were really good at this. And we weren't the only ones bringing scenarios into natural resource management. We were one of 2 or 3 or 4 different groups doing so, and we've all sort of found each other and cross-fertilized. But what we found is that scenarios are really good at engaging participants and getting people talking. You bring to them the technical information, which they have a hand in helping develop, and then you build on top of that technical information about climate the implications for resources and what this means for current practices or goals. And what we found is that this has worked so well, we've kept at it. We've done dozens of workshops, scores of partners, parks, regions, and networks. And we've written some guidance about how to do this. And this isn't the only guidance, but we've told our own story a little bit. And we have 4 key points when we think about the suitability of a scenario approach in what we do. The first, as we sort of talked about, is this is a great tool for dealing with uncontrollable, consequential uncertainty that you can't responsibly ignore. Climate change is that circumstance. Science is central, and we often get a response that people say, you know, the scenario planning where we're asked to imagine the future is getting kind of squishy. And what we remind people is we base our thinking here on all of the information and understandings of the systems we can pull together, and then we're relying on manager expertise to tell us what the implications are. You know, so this is actually fairly robust process. And finally, that as I've said before, that having this structure and having this engagement helps managers address these challenges and really grapple with them in a forward-looking way that one wouldn't do without this kind of structure. We have 4 scenarios for, or 4 criteria for our scenarios. This is my last slide like this, and then I'll show some illustrations. Plausible. Plausibility is about being grounded in the science, believable. Challenging. The whole point of these exercises is to stretch our thinking and get beyond some of our psychological shortcuts. And this is where having a good structure and following it can really help us with that. Relevant. If we're working in the Northern Great Plains, we're not talking about sea level rise to give a trivial example, but more precisely, we work very hard to make sure that the factors that we're focusing on are really the ones that are most relevant for the resources that our managers are concerned about. And divergence. This is the final most important criterion in my mind, is when we're structuring these scenarios, we have in our mind some notion that there's a cone of uncertainty going forward as to how things might play out. And what we're trying to do with scenarios is encompass as much of that cone, and I'm talking about it in 2 dimensions, but it's more than that, as much of that uncertainty as we can, so as not to be surprised, so that we are rehearsing for whatever might play out. So a couple of examples just to show you, starting with a simple one that's more on the qualitative end. This is Assateague National Seashore on the eastern coast of the US. It's a barrier island system. It has vegetated uplands, it has estuaries, it has open ocean, and it's important to a lot of people culturally and recreationally. And in our work with this park a few years ago, we asked our first question to make sure we're being relevant. What are the critical forces that will affect park resources and operations in the future? What are you concerned about? And of those, what are those that are really consequential and really uncertain? And not surprisingly, they mentioned sea level rise, which they identified as ranging within their time horizon, again qualitatively, as low to moderate or significant. And the other one was storminess, which the information at the time suggested could range from no change in strength and actually a decline in frequency to an increase in both intensity and frequency. Okay, so we've got these 2 factors. So now what do we do? Well, the simplest way to create scenarios is to just cross those 2 arrows. And so now we have a matrix. And so now the park gets to work, and we say, okay, let's talk about what happens in that lower left corner, perhaps, where we've got low to moderate sea level rise, and we don't see an increase in storminess. Well, we would see some decline in island size just because of the sea level rise, some increased pressure on the dynamic system as a whole, so sort of minimal change, you might say. Well, what about if we instead look at the one where sea level rise is still low, but we've got that enhanced storminess? We see the general same change in size of the island and the estuary, but we see more overwash, more dune erosion. They're starting to think about infrastructure effects. So you can see already those are 2 different futures. One of them, they're worried about roads and parking lots and bathrooms. The other one, they're not. Okay, so now let's turn up the sea level rise, turn down the storminess, And we're talking about saltwater intrusion, we're talking about a smaller island, and even a shift in the island. So some geomorphological processes going on. And then finally, our maximum of both of these, we're starting to get fragmentation of the island itself, submersion of it, and pervasive impacts. So the park in this case, and this we often encourage, comes up with short handles for these scenarios. And not surprisingly, that top right one is sandbar. That'll get people's attention. And these are useful in just helping us work with more than one future. It's a challenge for the human brain to two-track or three-track or four-track thinking about the future. But again, these structures and these processes help us do that. Okay, so a more sophisticated example where we were more quantitative and had a more iterative engagement approach. This is that CSC-funded project that Dennis alluded to, and it's about scaling climate change adaptation in the Northern Great Plains. And it draws together a handful of us representing a diversity of organizations and agencies. We worked on this project. We had a focus in central North Dakota and also southwestern South Dakota. My focus here will be on the South Dakota component. And I'm not going to get into this engagement diagram in great detail, except to say that we did a lot of careful thinking about when we are in participatory planning, when we are developing our summaries, when we're doing simulation modeling, which I'm not going to cover very much here. Sorry, Brian. And basically, I'm just going to walk you through our process. It began in August of 2015 with an orientation trip to the park. We spent 2 full days, a day in the field and a day in the office with a full range of staff, really trying to make sure that our work was relevant, really trying to understand what their resources of concern were. And they were diverse and complex. They were interested in erosion and the badlands themselves because of infrastructure built on top of those erosible substrates. They were interested in grasslands and grazing, of course, and bison, and also other smaller mammals that depend on that system. And they were interested in road maintenance, as I've alluded to already. So great. We came back to them 6 months later, having done the basic work of creating divergent, plausible, relevant climate futures. And this is what we brought to them. And we, as I'll show you in a minute, we brought in quantitative terms as well. But these are 4 very plausible futures. At the top, one that emphasizes heat. The next one that emphasizes heat combined with an extreme in moisture and precipitation. One that emphasizes variability in precipitation. And then one that's more on the dry end. And you could, of course, come up with ones in between these, an infinite number of combinations. And the point is, well, the brain can't handle that, maybe a computer can. So we have to winnow it down to a few representative ones of the range, with the thinking that the climate may not play out exactly like any of these 4, but somewhere, some mix of these or somewhere in between. And if we do our thinking across this span, we'll be better than if we haven't done any rehearsing to begin with. Now here's an example of some of the quantitative information. So this is precipitation under each of the scenarios by month against the historical data, which are in black, and done in absolute terms and also relative to historical. So this is beginning to kind of give this information to managers more specifically than this sort of annual information that often isn't very useful. This is slightly complex. Let me see if I can walk us through it. This is representing several different things. Growing season length change, last spring freeze date, and on the top left, annual average temperature. And left of the dashed lines are the mean conditions mid-century for our 4 scenarios. And on the right are conditions in individual recent years. So those would have been recent extreme years compared against mean future conditions. And we emphasized, of course, that these mean conditions, there's going to be all kinds of variability around that, but it's just to get a sense from a manager's own experience what that future might look like in general. People seem to like this. So with that basic climate skeleton, what teams now do, teams who've had a good influence in creating that skeleton, we now ask them to think about what are the effects under each of these futures, going one by one, on whatever class of resource you're concerned about. And so those get built out in this participatory way. Here's an example of a cleaned up sheet showing at the top socio-political developments and implications, and at the bottom natural resource ones. For 4 columns are 4 scenarios. So there's a lot of condensing of work that looks more like this to get to that. So here's Eddie Childress, who is a biologist dealing with the bison at Badlands National Park. He had had no previous engagement with scenarios. And I think Brian's smiling in the back because our first meeting, he kept his sunglasses on the whole time, and he was the guy I thought we were going to have a problem with. And I was delighted to realize that was only because the room was bright or something. And we come back our second workshop, and he's loving this, and he's leading his group. And so we end up with a sheet like this, and these are all the bison or grazing specific implications in that sheet. So a lot of stuff being drawn out of that. And just to illustrate sort of trying to think about individual goals under individual scenarios, which is where this was headed. In this case, they're looking at that jungle scenario, the hottest and wettest, and they've stated their current goal, which is 1,000 animals in 17 genetic groups. And they've asked themselves, is this goal tenable in either the short or the long term? And the answer underlined in red for both is yes. However, the means of achieving it would change in this warmer, wetter world. And so they lay out some revisions to their actions that they might consider. So here's an example of a climate retrofit. And this is kind of where this thinking went. And we can ultimately, synthesize all of this into a table like this, where we're looking across resources, across scenarios, and summarizing where is it we need to retrofit our approach to get our goal, where do we need to change our goal, and where are we good with business as usual. And you can see sort of a spectrum depending on the resource and the scenario. Basically, what I've been showing you is the merging of some of the climate smart planning approach and principles with scenario planning. And this is kind of where we're all headed. And in fact, the National Park Service and the National Wildlife Federation are busy doing this formally for the Park Service. And here's an illustration just showing that process with thinking about more than one future at each step. So we're working on structuring that. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here with a legal and policy analysis. This is fairly brief, and then I'd be excited to take questions. One of the things that people often think, and I don't blame them for it, is that because we're a preservation-oriented agency, that managing for change and adapting to climate change must be something that's almost impossible to do. And from a legal perspective, which is where that thinking starts with the 1916 NPS Organic Act that created the Park Service, what I can say is that Eric Bieber and Elizabeth Long Esposito, both of UC Berkeley Law School, have done the legal analysis, the high-level legal analysis on the Organic Act and the Wilderness Act. And what the quote here says is that the Organic Act and park-specific enabling acts, as interpreted by the courts, grant the Park Service wide discretion to pursue management options for adaptation in national parks, and that this law will remain relevant and can guide us in adaptation. I'm not going to get into the details, but that's the overall conclusion. Similarly, they say with the Wilderness Act, there's some important procedural and substantive hoops that one must always go through in justifying management intervention in designated wilderness, but that again, the law is flexible enough to allow adaptation. It's about making one's case within the structures that are already established. And this paper is great because right at the end, they have a table where they categorize different categories of management approaches, motorized, non-motorized, et cetera, and they talk about how those different approaches screen against this law. So it's very useful. What we deal with that are tougher for us are the policy, the internal agency questions, which we call the gnarly questions. And these are defined as a climate change adaptation issue for which management or planning lacks clear guidance, or where you may feel like you're inhibited under current policy. And here's an example. Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore on the southern shores of Lake Michigan has a butterfly, the corner blue butterfly, that's been listed as endangered since 1992 federally. And this was a place where we had great success in the 90s with restoring and stabilizing those populations. It's the warmest, most southerly location for the species. And it's been in decline, this population now for many years, slowly, steadily declining. And so the park in response was basically asking, should we try to aggressively resist this change, maybe plant the host plant in the coldest places we can find in the park, or should we abandon that goal, recognize this, that we're in an era of continuous accelerating change, and make a more regional commitment to the welfare of the species? These aren't typical questions from our past in the Park Service, not exactly. And so we call them gnarly because we don't necessarily have ready answers. It takes some thinking and some digestion. And so what we did is we constituted expert topic teams that included representatives from parks asking these questions, Washington office subject matter experts into a process of really digesting these questions and thinking carefully. And we have a document in preparation with some case studies to start getting our thinking going. And basically, it's a very simple approach: provide enough scientific background and management background to understand the problem, flesh out the adaptation options without filtering, and then screen them against policy to see where we sit. And the idea is ultimately we're not going to make new policy with this effort, but we will inform the development of new policy by bringing these case studies up and really digesting them. And so back to our example, the question is, what do we do? And so in that step, what we said is, okay, let's flesh out a whole range of potential strategies. And let's make sure that, as we see in these 3 columns, we've got at least one strategy in every part of our spectrum so that we're thinking broadly. So we did that. And then you take each of those groups of strategies and you do your screening against policy, you do your analysis. And effectively, what you're trying to do is make the best case under policy for this action. And what we find is some actions are difficult to defend under current policy because it was written in 2006 before climate change was really in everybody's consciousness, and it's essentially silent on climate change. We screen the autonomous change, the directed change, of course, the whole spectrum. And I'm not going to get into details much except to say our greatest challenge when we do this is the word natural. So when I take our entire management policies document and I make a word cloud out of it, literally the biggest word may be natural. It's certainly bigger than NPS. It occurs more than 500 times in our policy document. And here's some text. This is 3 sentences, continuous sentences of text, and you can see the prominence of the idea of natural or native in it. And yet we recognize that in a world of pervasive change, this might be a problem, because here's our definition of natural in policies. It is the condition of resources that would occur in the absence of human dominance over the landscape. For a person like me who's thinking about climate change, who's looking at that measles map, I'm wondering where that place is. And others are as well. And that's why this thinking, this Revisiting Leopold report that we commissioned a few years ago, starts to point the way for where we need to go instead. And so they say we have to prepare for an era of continuous change. We have to grapple with and accept that change is ongoing. And I don't have time to get into details, but what I will say is there's documentation under this being developed right now in the Park Service to clarify our largely silent policy and get specific about what it means to manage in an era of continuous change. And some of our gnarly work that's building from the parks upward and being grounded is really helping inform some of that top-down development. So we're meeting in the middle in a way that really works both on the ground and is consistent with law and policy on the top. I'm going to stop in just a moment, but what I'd say is, personally, for me, coming out of a basic science background, to have evolved slowly into being this boundary actor where I do a little bit of science production, but a lot of translation, and we get into policy and the philosophy of what we're all doing here. I think it's a fascinating time to be in natural resource management and adaptation. And we're not a big community, really, and it's new and it's exciting, and we're building our tools as we're using them. It's a really sort of like evolutionary radiation. This is really an exciting time to be in the field, and I'm looking forward to working with a number of you, I'm sure, in the future in adaptation. So thanks very much. Looks like we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
Of the 4 pillars, I was curious about the mitigation. Maybe it's because of what you do in this series, but can you talk a little bit about what the Park Service is doing in that? I asked from the Climate Science Center side, we are definitely more geared toward adaptation and been told to stay away from mitigation, not our sort of wheelhouse. But I think NPS has some leverage with their infrastructure and how they do it. So maybe just a few comments.
Yeah, we do, and we don't have those constraints. For us, and I think for everybody, we recognize the complementarity of mitigation and adaptation. We didn't used to. I remember a decade ago, I was all about mitigation, and adaptation felt like giving up. Now we recognize there's change baked in the cake that we're going to have to deal with. But if we don't mitigate, we can only adapt to so much. You hear many people say that. In the Park Service, we have a tremendous amount of infrastructure because we have 300 million people visiting our units every year. And so, you know, if you stand back and look at us, we are potentially a large emitter. We are also, because of that visitation, we can provide a very powerful example of how to do things differently. And so if one asks our director about climate change response in the Park Service, he's going to talk as much about our success in mitigation as in adaptation, and he will talk about the Green Parks Plan and Climate Friendly Parks, which are two programs that have been incredibly successful and prominent in the NPS. And if you want to show graphs, easy graphs about success in responding to climate change, you show graphs of our declining emissions and things like that, and how we're doing relative to goals we set. And so we've been very successful in that. I sort of glided over some of the intra-agency distinctions, but the program within the Park Service that focuses on facilities and mitigation is different from our program. They're a sister program. We work closely together, but they literally came more out of the facilities management realm, which I think is great. They sort of literally came out of the management sector of the Park Service thinking about that. And those folks, when you talk adaptation or mitigation, they get it. When we talk adaptation with facilities people, they understand what a change in precipitation means for a roadway, for a parking lot, for visitor safety. And so the two go hand in hand together for us. And if you want to see good success in mitigation, the Park Service is a really good representation of that. In the back.
Yeah, once you've been through one of these scenario exercises, given that it's uncertain which scenario is likely to play out, how can the park then use the predictions for management planning? How do they go about that? What's the next step?
Yeah, I sort of held back on getting into that, thinking that you'd probably ask about that, somebody would, and then I could get into it. It's a bit complicated. You know, what we say is scenarios are most suitable where you're making long-term, consequential, irreversible decisions. When you're making short-term reversible ones, fine, you can take a different kind of responsive approach. And ultimately, what do you do with this divergent? It depends on the investment you're making. I'll give you one example where it worked really well to try and encompass the whole range. So Apostle Islands and Bob Carmanecker, who I talked about, they noticed that lake levels were down in the last few years, lower than they've ever seen, and it was destroying their docks. And Apostle Islands is basically a collection of islands, and visitors go island to island in boats, so providing a way for them to get off boats onto islands is what it's all about. And there's something like 32 docks in this park. And so they knew they had to redesign their docks. They understood, looking at the projections, that lake levels could go up by X amount or down by X amount, basically. They have a range to work with, and that's just what we've got. So what they did is they designed a dock that is robust to that full range. And I won't get into the details, but in the end, it's a $500,000 dock, and they're thinking about replacing 30 of them. So there's $16 million of investment that's supposed to last 30 years. You don't want to place your bet wrong on something like that. And so in their case, they just dealt with the whole range. There are alternatives where you may say, okay, the future I see might play out into the jungle scenario or awfully dry, let's say in the Northern Great Plains. I may hold off on making certain commitments or stage my entry into a commitment so that I can pull back or refine. So that's another way that you might manage that risk and make your decision. There's a third really simple way that we can use scenarios, which is they can help us see that in most cases, the future, that the conditions we're managing in today aren't within the spectrum of what to expect in the future. And what that means is there may be things we're doing today, things we're investing in that simply don't have a future. If we can stop doing that today, that's money in our pockets, or it's staff time back in our staff time budget. And that's huge. We call those no gainers. And so if we can identify no gainers through a scenario prism, we've already given ourselves extra capacity to now deal with those tougher challenges. And analogously, I had a manager of Haleakala National Park. We were having this conversation, and he said, we were fighting an invasive plant for a decade. We didn't succeed. We've had to cut bait on that. You know, these things happen. He said, I would love to get those 10,000 man hours back. You know, that was a hemorrhage, and we can't get that back. We have to make better decisions like this. We have to be more forward-looking. So there's an illustration of just cutting bait on things without a future.
So Gregor, some of the early successes with scenario planning as you mentioned, we're military or defense oriented and business oriented, but there you could define single goals fairly or clearly. I want to win. In this conservation landscape, we have aquatic species, we have terrestrial species, we have landscape goals that sometimes if you come up with a particular strategy, it may be in conflict with another goal. And so how often do you have time to actually map out like the bison result in Badlands, but then also then look at sort of the grazing component, and map. Do you have time to map them back out and say where are we seeing some unintended consequences? If we do the bison effort, we're going to hammer the forage, or vice versa. Yeah. If we want to conserve the endangered species that's associated with that grassland, then what do we do with the bison?
Yeah.
The goals. So at what point do you actually start, sort of comparing, contrasting those goal statements and your strategies?
What I would say is that it happens fairly early on. It sort of gives you a window into a park. You sort of see where those tensions are, and that's because scenario planning is a participatory process. So fairly quickly, you get, as we showed, we bring the sort of climate backbone, we break these groups out, and we say, what does this mean for prairie dogs? What does this mean for black-footed ferrets? What does it mean for bison? What does it mean for paleontological resources? And you see sort of the underlying, sort of maybe not unhealthy tensions in a park between people who focus on different resources. And so what I would say is this discussion of aligning, harmonizing, or choosing among goals is something that goes on anyway. And once you start talking about scenarios, you jump into that local conversation immediately, I think. What I think we can do with using our structure, and especially, and I didn't get into it, bringing in some really careful simulation modeling, is to provide some real understanding of what is likely very quantitatively to play out. What does it mean when you increase your bison herd? And so we can inform what might be a longstanding simmering debate with new information. And I've sort of almost got it on the tip of my tongue, but I'm going to stay away from it. But that in some cases, this information can resolve what had been a disagreement that simply needed more information. So we certainly don't shy away from that. And what I'd say is, in the end, this is still the park's decision. Parks are autonomous. They're very autonomous units. We're a decentralized system. And our job is to bring the information, to confront these challenges, including those challenges of goal compatibility or incompatibility, lay it all out there. And ultimately, though, it's going to be the managers who make that informed decision.
Well, and I guess looking at the time, I want to thank Gregor. This has really been fascinating to give these perspectives and insights to what the National Park Service is doing. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder, next Friday we have Brad Udall talking about water resources, especially in the Colorado River system. So you're welcome back 11 o'clock next Friday.
Thank you, Dennis. That's great. This was fun.
Yeah.
It's always good to just talk about what you do. You have to think about what you do.
Yeah. No, nice.
Very nice, Dave Swift.
Good to meet you, Dave.
We've done a lot of scenario stuff in East Africa.
Okay. Yeah.
The difference I see between what you're doing and what we did is here, the people who are interested in park services have almost zero control over the climate change.
Right.
In our case, it's a situation where people do have some control. Like, what will happen if you double the amount of agriculture? If the Maasai population rises by 100%. Okay, so then we can say, okay, if that